All right, so today we're diving into some pretty intense stuff.
Yeah.
This idea that American democracy basically ended when Trump got reelected.
It's a really fascinating question and reflects, I think, a lot of the anxieties that people are feeling right now.
Totally. And just to be clear up front, we're not here to say whether or not we agree with that or not,
Right.
or whether this theory is right or wrong.
Yeah.
But we are going to dig into the arguments
Yeah.
and kind of figure out what's going on and why this idea is resonating with so many people.
Yeah. And you've given us some pretty fascinating material to work with.
Yeah.
We have this really interesting discussion between political commentator Stephen Bonnell, who goes by Destiny Online,
Yeah.
and Tom Jocelyn, who's a counterterrorism expert who was on the January 6th committee. So
Wow.
talk about firsthand experience.
Oh, totally.
And then we also have some other conversations and news segments where Destiny lays out his views a little bit more.
Yeah, so we can get a really nice, well-rounded picture
Yeah.
of his perspective.
It's definitely timely, especially
Yeah.
with the special counsel's report on the 2020 elections just coming out.
For sure.
But before we get lost in the weeds here,
Yeah.
I want to throw this back to you.
Okay.
Have you ever felt like the whole system is just like broken?
Oh, yeah.
Like democracy in America is not working the way it should?
For sure.
Because that's really the kind of feeling that this idea is tapping into.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so let's get into Destiny's main argument.
Yeah.
He talks a lot about this really fractured media landscape that we're all living in now, where people are basically living in these echo chambers and filter bubbles.
Yeah. Have you ever noticed how social media seems to only show you stuff that you already agree with?
Exactly.
It's like it's curated for you
yeah,
to just
sure.
confirm your biases.
Yeah, and it sounds really good in theory, right? Like you're curating your own news feeds and stuff, but it can lead to these self-reinforcing loops where you're just constantly exposed to one side of the story. And Destiny actually uses this really powerful example of his own mom,
Oh.
who started believing misinformation online. And I think it really illustrates how real this can get.
Yeah.
How it can affect our relationships, and how hard it is to even talk to people who see the world differently.
That story really stuck with me, too.
Yeah.
It's like we're not even arguing about
Right.
politics anymore. We're arguing about what's true.
Exactly.
And that brings us to January 6th, the whole insurrection.
Yes.
Because Destiny really ties that back to this lack of a shared reality.
Totally. And this is where Tom Jocelyn's perspective is just absolutely fascinating.
Yeah.
He was on the January 6th committee, so he saw all the evidence,
Oh.
all the testimonies, all the behind-the-scenes stuff.
Yeah.
And when he talks about analyzing Trump's speech from that day, it's chilling.
Yeah.
He even talks about what he believes is the most incendiary line
Okay.
ever spoken by a sitting U.S. president.
Wait, you can't leave me hanging like that.
Well, so he actually breaks down Trump's word choice and intent
Okay.
before he reveals the line because, even without explicitly calling for violence, the potential was definitely there.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
But the line itself is, you got to fight like hell. And if you don't fight like hell, we're not going to have a country anymore.
Wow. That is pretty intense.
Yeah.
And, I think for Destiny, this wasn't just like a random outburst.
Right.
This was a symptom of a much deeper problem.
Exactly.
He sees this as being like a breaking point,
Yeah.
showing how much trust in our institutions has really eroded.
And he doesn't just say that. He actually points to evidence, things like the lack of accountability for people involved in the insurrection.
Yeah.
Especially when you compare it to how left-leaning protesters are treated.
Yeah, like a double standard.
It feels like a double standard.
Yeah.
And it further erodes trust in the whole justice system.
Yeah, and that's where that like doomer outlook comes in.
Yeah.
Right? It's
Yeah.
like he sees this as the start of a spiral,
Absolutely.
not just like a one-time event.
He's worried that Trump's refusal to concede in 2020 set a dangerous precedent,
Yeah.
and that future elections could be even more messed up with more voter suppression, more attempts to overturn results, and just chaos.
Okay, I can see why people are finding this idea so compelling.
Yeah.
It really does tap into a lot of anxieties that I think we're all feeling.
Totally.
But I'm guessing it's not the only perspective out there.
Oh, definitely not. Some people think this is completely overblown,
Okay.
that American democracy has survived tough times before,
Yeah.
and that it'll bounce back from this too.
Okay.
But we'll get into those counter arguments a little bit later.
Yeah.
But for now, I think it's valuable to just keep focusing on understanding this end of democracy narrative because clearly it speaks to something
Yeah,
that's real, that's happening.
absolutely. Okay, so
Yeah.
let's unpack this idea of declining trust even further.
Yeah.
It's not just about the government.
Yeah, it's not.
Like, it's kind of spreading out.
It's spreading to media science experts.
Yeah.
Basically any source of authority.
It's like, how do we even have a conversation if we can't agree on the basic facts?
Exactly.
It's just people talking past each other.
All the time.
Yeah. And it's not just frustrating.
Yeah.
It makes it almost impossible to solve problems.
Exactly. And he points to Congress where nothing gets done.
Yeah.
It's all partisan fighting scoring points and not actual governing.
Right.
And that just reinforces that sense that the system is broken.
Right. And he ties that into a critique of the two-party system itself, right?
Yes.
Like, they've become so focused on power that they've forgotten about the people that they're supposed to represent.
That's a huge part of his argument.
Yeah.
He sees both parties as so entrenched and so caught up in their own games
Yeah.
that they're not even trying to solve problems anymore. And that raises a really important question.
What's that?
Is this system even capable of dealing with the massive challenges that we're facing
Yeah.
in the 21st century?
Yeah.
Or are we just clinging to something that doesn't work anymore?
Wow. Okay,
Yeah.
so we've laid out the foundation here. We've got this fractured media landscape, declining trust, a broken political system.
Yes.
And January 6th as this kind of explosive symptom of all that.
Exactly. And now I think it's time to start digging into some of the specific examples that Destiny uses to illustrate his point.
Okay.
Because he doesn't just say democracy is dead.
Yeah.
He actually gives a lot of concrete evidence to support his argument.
All right, so where do we start? What kind of examples is he using?
Well, one of the things he talks about is Trump's obsession with tariffs.
Okay.
And it's not just about trade policy. It's about this bigger trend of rejecting expertise and evidence-based decision-making.
Yeah.
He actually plays this clip where Trump is bragging about how tariffs are making America rich and helping pay off the national debt.
Oh, yeah. I remember it was like he had this almost childlike view of economics.
Exactly.
And it really resonated with a certain segment of the population who are just so frustrated with the status quo.
Totally. And that's part of what Destiny finds so concerning.
Yeah.
It's not just that Trump had bad policies.
Yeah.
It's that he was actively undermining the very idea of expertise and evidence.
This wasn't just about economics.
No, this was across a lot of different areas.
Yeah.
Another example he brings up is Trump's disdain for international institutions like NATO.
Right.
He saw alliances and partnerships as weaknesses, as somehow putting America at a disadvantage.
Yeah.
There's this clip where he actually suggests that the U.S. might withdraw from NATO if other countries don't increase their defense spending.
It was like this America First mentality that just completely ignored the realities of a globalized world.
Exactly.
And it worried a lot of people in the U.S. and internationally.
Yeah, and it fits into this pattern of rejecting established norms and institutions.
Yeah.
Which Destiny sees as a key part of the erosion of democracy.
Okay, so we've got tariffs, we've got NATO. What else?
Well, another big one is Trump's attacks on the judiciary, especially when judges ruled against him.
Right.
He would constantly label them as biased or unfair, basically trying to delegitimize their decisions and erode public trust in the courts.
Yeah, that was like a constant theme throughout his presidency.
Totally.
And it really raised concerns about the separation of powers.
Yes.
And the rule of law. Like, if the president can just dismiss any ruling he doesn't like, what does that mean for our system of checks and balances?
Exactly. And Destiny sees this as another example of Trump chipping away at the foundations of democracy.
Yeah.
He's not just disagreeing with rulings.
Right.
He's actively undermining the legitimacy of the judicial branch itself.
Okay, so we're starting to see a pattern here.
Yes.
Tariffs, NATO,
yes,
the judiciary.
Yes.
It's like Trump was constantly testing the limits of his power.
Pushing against the norms of our system.
And for Destiny, it's not just about Trump himself.
Right.
It's about the broader political climate that he fostered.
Totally.
And the way he normalized this behavior. And the potential for future leaders to do the same thing.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so what other examples does Destiny bring up? Because I'm sure there's plenty more.
Oh, there are tons. He talks about Trump's attempts to interfere with investigations into his own conduct.
Oh, yeah?
Things like firing FBI Director James Comey and pressuring the Justice Department to drop investigations into Russian interference in the 2016 election.
It was like he saw the rule of law as something that applied to everybody but him.
Exactly.
And it raised concerns about corruption and abuse of power.
Absolutely. And for Destiny, these are all signs of authoritarian tendencies, a willingness to subvert democratic norms for personal gain.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've seen how destiny connects this fractured media landscape declining trust to the events of January 6th.
Yeah.
And we've started to look at some specific examples of how Trump's actions eroded democratic norms and institutions.
Right. And I think it's important to remember that while we're focusing on destiny's perspective right now, we're not saying this is the only way to view these events.
Right. There are other viewpoints out there, and we'll definitely explore those.
For sure.
But I think it's really valuable to understand where this end of democracy narrative comes from.
Yeah.
Because clearly it speaks to something that a lot of people are feeling.
Absolutely. And I think that's what makes this whole deep dive so fascinating.
Totally.
It's not just about analyzing the past.
Yeah.
It's about understanding the present and grappling with the uncertainties of the future. Okay,
so where do we go from here? What else does Destiny highlight in his argument?
Well, he doesn't just focus on Trump's actions. Okay. He also talks about the broader cultural and social trends that he sees as contributing to this democratic decline.
Okay.
Things like the rise of social media, the decline of traditional institutions, and the growing influence of money in politics.
Okay, so it sounds like we're about to get into some really complex stuff. I'm ready to dive in, but I'm also wondering, how does this all connect back to the average person?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And it's one that Destiny himself addresses.
Okay.
He argues that these trends affect all of us, whether we realize it or not.
Okay.
They shape the information we consume, the choices we make, and the way we interact with each other.
Right.
And ultimately, they determine the kind of society we live in.
So it's not just like an abstract political theory.
Exactly.
It's about our everyday lives.
It affects all of us.
Okay, I'm ready to dive in.
Let's do it. So let's start with social media. I mean, it's become such a huge part of our lives, but Destiny sees it as a real double-edged sword.
Okay.
On the one hand, it's amazing for connecting people and spreading information.
Right.
But on the other hand, it's become this breeding ground for misinformation and hate speech.
Oh, yeah.
And these crazy echo chambers where people are just getting their biases confirmed over and over again.
Yeah, I've definitely fallen into those rabbit holes myself. You start reading one article and then the algorithm just feeds you a bunch more.
Totally.
That are like even more extreme.
It's scary how easy it is to get sucked in.
Yeah.
And Destiny argues that these algorithms are literally designed to keep us hooked.
Right.
Not to give us accurate information.
Right. It's about engagement.
They prioritize engagement and outrage.
Yeah.
Which means that the most sensationalistic, the most divisive content rises to the top.
Yeah. And it's not just about individuals getting sucked in.
Right.
Destiny points out that these platforms have become incredibly powerful tools for political manipulation.
Totally.
They can be used to spread propaganda, to target specific groups with misinformation.
Yes.
To sow chaos and distrust.
And he's really critical of how these platforms are often so slow to react to these problems.
Yeah, it's like they prioritize profits.
Yeah, profits over the well-being of their users and the health of our democracy.
Well, what does he think needs to be done? Does he think we need more regulation?
He definitely thinks there needs to be more accountability.
Okay.
He advocates for stronger regulations to force these platforms to moderate content more effectively, to combat misinformation, and to create a more civil online environment.
Okay, that makes sense. So social media is one big piece of the puzzle.
Yes.
What about the decline of traditional institutions?
Okay.
What's Destiny's take on that?
Well, he talks about how institutions like organized religion and labor unions used to provide this sense of community and shared purpose for a lot of people.
Yeah.
But as these institutions have declined, it's created this void in people's lives. They're searching for belonging, for meaning, and sometimes they find it in extremist groups or ideologies.
Yeah, it's like people are looking for something to believe in.
Totally.
It's like to connect them to something bigger than themselves. Yeah. And when they don't find it in those traditional ways, they're more vulnerable to these more extreme movements.
Yeah, exactly. And Destiny sees this as part of this bigger picture of societal fragmentation.
Right.
People are feeling isolated, atomized, and distrustful of the establishment.
Yeah.
And that makes them more susceptible to these populist appeals that promise simple solutions.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
To complex problems.
Okay, so we've got social media. We've got the decline of traditional institutions. Yeah. What about money in politics?
Okay.
I'm guessing Destiny has some strong opinions about that, too.
Oh, absolutely. He sees the influence of money in politics as one of the most corrosive forces in our democracy.
Yeah.
He argues that the current system where wealthy donors and special interests have so much sway is fundamentally undemocratic.
Yeah, it creates a system where politicians are more accountable to their donors than to their constituents.
Exactly.
Yeah, and it creates cynicism, apathy.
Totally.
This feeling that the system is rigged
Yes.
against ordinary people.
And so what's the solution?
Yeah, what does he propose?
Well, he's a big advocate for campaign finance reform. He wants stricter limits on campaign contributions, more transparency in political spending, and public financing of elections to level the playing field and reduce the influence of money.
That sounds great in theory, but is it realistic? I mean, wouldn't the politicians who benefit from the current system fight tooth and nail against any kind of reform?
He acknowledges that it would be an uphill battle, but he argues that it's a fight worth having. He believes that without campaign finance reform, our democracy will continue to be distorted by the influence of wealth and power.
Okay, so it sounds like Destiny is painting a pretty bleak picture here.
It's pretty dark.
Social media, declining institutions, money and politics.
Yeah.
It's a lot to process.
That's a lot.
But I'm curious, does he offer any solutions? Or is he just resigned to this doom and gloom outlook?
Well, he's definitely not Pollyannish.
Okay.
He recognizes the severity of the challenges that we face,
Yeah.
but he's not completely hopeless either.
Okay.
He does offer some potential paths forward. Okay.
But they all require effort and engagement from citizens.
Okay, so what are some of the things he suggests?
Well, one thing he really emphasizes is the importance of critical thinking and media literacy.
Yeah.
He wants people to be more discerning consumers of information, to be able to identify misinformation and propaganda, and to fact-check claims before sharing them.
Yeah, that's crucial in today's information environment. It's so easy to just get swept up in the latest viral trend or outrage.
Yeah.
But we need to take a step back and critically evaluate what we're seeing and hearing.
Exactly. And he also talks about the importance of engaging in respectful dialogue with people who hold different views.
Okay.
He believes that we need to break out of our echo chambers to listen to each other and to try to understand where the other side is coming from.
That sounds challenging, especially in today's polarized climate.
It is.
But I agree that it's necessary if we just retreat into our own ideological bubbles.
Yeah.
We're never going to solve any problems.
Yeah.
Exactly. And Destiny argues that this kind of dialogue is essential for building bridges, finding common ground, and moving forward as a society.
Okay, so we've got critical thinking, we've got dialogue. What else does he suggest?
Well, he also talks about the need for systemic reforms.
Okay.
He's a big believer in tackling problems at their root, not just treating the symptoms.
So what kind of reforms does he have in mind?
He mentions things like electoral reform to make our elections more fair and representative.
Okay.
He supports ideas like ranked choice voting and open primaries to reduce the influence of party extremes and encourage more moderate candidates.
That makes sense. And I'm guessing he's also a fan of campaign finance reform, which we talked about earlier.
Absolutely. He sees that as a crucial piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
He also talks about the need for reforms to address issues like gerrymandering, which allows politicians to manipulate electoral districts to their advantage, creating uncompetitive elections and a lack of accountability.
Yeah. That's a big problem.
Yeah.
It feels like the system is rigged in favor of the incumbents and the party in power.
Right. And Destiny argues that these kinds of structural reforms are essential for creating a more level playing field. And a more responsive democracy.
Okay, so we've got critical thinking dialogue, systemic reforms. It sounds like a tall order.
It's a lot.
But I appreciate that Destiny is at least offering some solutions.
Yeah.
Some ways to push back against these negative trends.
Well, absolutely. He doesn't just want to wallow in despair.
Yeah.
He wants to empower people to take action. To fight for the kind of future they want to see.
Okay, so we've explored a lot of Destiny's key arguments and his proposed solutions.
Yes.
But I'm wondering, what about the other side of the coin?
Okay.
What are some of the counter-arguments to this end of democracy narrative?
That's a great question, and it's important to consider those alternative perspectives.
Yeah.
Because as compelling as Destiny's argument is, it's not the only way to view these events. There are people who believe that American democracy is more resilient than we give it credit for.
Okay.
That it's weathered storms before, and that it will bounce back from this too.
Okay, so what are some of the arguments they make? What makes them more optimistic about the future of American democracy?
Well, one point they often make is that Trump ultimately lost the 2020 election.
Okay.
Despite his attempts to overturn the results the system held.
Okay.
The courts rejected his claims, state officials certified the results, and Congress affirmed Biden's victory.
Yeah, that's a good point. It does suggest that our institutions are stronger than some people give them credit for.
And they also point to the work of the January 6th committee, which meticulously investigated the attack and held those responsible accountable. They see it as a sign that our democracy is capable of self-correction, of learning from its mistakes and taking steps to prevent them from happening again.
Okay, so we have the 2020 election, the January 6th committee. What else gives them hope?
They also point to the fact that Trump's influence within the Republican Party seems to be waning. Many of his supporters are becoming disillusioned with his rhetoric and his antics. And there's a growing movement within the GOP to move beyond Trump and embrace a more pragmatic and less divisive approach to politics.
That's interesting. So they're basically saying that while the Trump era was a stressful and damaging period for our democracy, it might ultimately prove to be a wake-up call. A catalyst for positive change.
Exactly. They believe that the pendulum is swinging back towards normalcy, towards a more reasoned and less volatile political climate.
That's a more hopeful perspective. But I'm wondering, is there any evidence to support their optimism?
Well, it's still early to say for sure, but there are some encouraging signs. For example, in recent elections, we've seen a number of moderate Republicans win primaries against more extreme Trump-aligned candidates. And there's growing public support for policies that address issues like climate change and gun violence, which suggests that the electorate might be moving away from the extremes.
That's interesting. So it sounds like there's a real debate going on here.
There is.
On one hand, we have Destiny's warning about the fragility of our democracy and the very real threats it faces. On the other hand, we have this more optimistic view that suggests that American democracy is resilient and capable of self-correction.
And I think it's important to engage with both of these perspectives because the truth is we don't know what the future holds. The outcome is not predetermined. It depends on the choices we make, the actions we take, and the way we engage with our democracy.
So it's not a time for complacency, but it's also not a time for despair. I need to be aware of the dangers, but also hopeful about the possibilities.
And I think that's what makes this whole deep dive so fascinating. It's not just about analyzing the past. It's about understanding the present and grappling with the uncertainties of the future.
So we've explored Destiny's arguments about the erosion of democratic norms, the rise of political violence, the influence of social media, the decline of traditional institutions. We've also considered the counter-arguments, the reasons for optimism, and the potential for renewal. It's a lot to process.
It is a lot. And now I think it's time to shift gears a bit and delve into a specific institution that's central to this whole conversation, the Constitution.
The Constitution, it's the bedrock of our democracy.
The
document that lays out the framework for our government.
It is.
But Missing Destiny has some complex thoughts about it, right?
You're reading his mind. He sees the Constitution as both a source of strength and a potential point of vulnerability. On the one hand, he acknowledges that it's created a system of checks and balances designed to prevent tyranny.
That's something we learn about in school. The whole idea of separation of powers. The different branches of government keeping each other in check. It's supposed to prevent any one person or group from having too much power. But Destiny also worries that these safeguards might not be enough. He points out that they can be eroded or even circumvented by a determined leader with enough support. I see where he's coming from. We've seen how norms and precedents can be chipped away, at how institutions can be pressured and manipulated. So even with a document like the Constitution in place, there's still a risk,
there is. And he uses Trump as an example of this. He talks about how Trump constantly tested the boundaries of his presidential powers, ignored norms and precedents, and basically just flouted the law whenever it suited him.
There were so many moments throughout his presidency where it felt like he was pushing the limits, seeing what he could get away with, and that's worrying. Because it sets a precedent for future leaders. If they see that someone can get away with bending the rules, they might be more likely to try it themselves.
And Destiny argues that this kind of behavior can normalize the erosion of democratic norms, making it easier for future leaders to further undermine our institutions.
So the Constitution while being a source of strength, also has potential vulnerabilities.
It does.
But it's not like we can just rewrite it every time we face a new challenge, right?
Right, and that's another point that Destiny brings up.
Yeah.
He's actually frustrated with how difficult it is to amend the Constitution.
Okay.
He argues that this rigidity makes it hard to adapt to the changing needs of a modern society.
Okay, I can see that the Constitution was written centuries ago.
Yeah.
And the world has changed a lot since then.
A lot.
So what are some of the specific issues he sees as problematic?
He points to things like gerrymandering the Electoral College and the influence of money in politics as examples of structural flaws that undermine the principles of fairness and representation that the Constitution is supposed to uphold.
Yeah. Those are all huge issues that have been debated for years.
For years.
And they definitely seem to be getting worse, not better.
Not better.
Right. And Destiny argues that these flaws make our democracy less responsive to the will of the people, less accountable, and ultimately less legitimate.
Exactly.
Okay, so it sounds like Destiny is raising some pretty fundamental questions about the Constitution.
Yeah.
And its ability to meet the challenges of the 21st century.
Big questions.
But I'm guessing he's not the only one who's thinking about this, right?
Definitely not. This is a debate that's been going on for a long time.
Yeah.
With legal scholars, historians, and political scientists all weighing in on how the Constitution should be interpreted and applied in a modern context.
Okay, so it's a complex issue with no easy answers.
No easy answer.
But I think it's really valuable to be having this conversation.
Yeah.
To be thinking critically about the foundations of our democracy and whether they're strong enough to withstand the challenges we're facing.
Absolutely. And I think that's what Destiny's trying to do.
Yeah.
He's not providing all the answers.
Right.
But he's raising important questions, provoking thought, and challenging us to engage more deeply with the systems that govern our lives.
Okay, so we've talked about the Constitution, its strengths, its vulnerabilities, and the ongoing debate about its role in a modern democracy.
Totally.
What other areas does Destiny highlight in his analysis?
Well, one area that he focuses on quite a bit is the legal battles surrounding the 2020 election and the attempts to overturn the results.
Right.
And he sees these legal challenges not just as isolated events, but as part of a broader pattern of trying to undermine faith in our electoral system.
Okay, so we're talking about all the lawsuits filed by Trump and his allies, the claims of widespread voter fraud, the pressure campaigns on state officials, all of that.
Exactly. And Destiny argues that these efforts, even though they ultimately failed, did significant damage to our democracy.
So what's the lasting impact of all that?
Well, for one thing, it created a narrative of a stolen election.
Right.
Which a significant portion of the population still believes.
Yeah.
And that undermines trust in the electoral process, making it harder to have peaceful transfers of power in the future.
Yeah, it feels like we're in this dangerous territory where people are questioning the very legitimacy of our elections.
Totally.
And that's a recipe for instability and conflict.
It is. And Destiny also argues that these legal challenges, even though they were mostly dismissed by the courts, still eroded public trust in the legal system itself.
Right.
It created this perception that the law is just another tool to be manipulated for political gain, rather than a neutral arbiter of justice.
Okay, so we're seeing how this erosion of trust extends beyond just the government.
Yes.
And into other areas of society.
It's spreading.
It's affecting our faith in the media, in science, in the legal system, in the very processes that are supposed to hold our democracy together.
Wait, and for Destiny, this is a deeply worrying trend.
Yeah.
He sees it as a sign that our democratic norms are fraying.
Yeah.
That the guardrails are weakening and that the potential for authoritarian backsliding is increasing.
Okay, so it's a pretty bleak picture.
It is.
But I'm wondering, are there any counter-arguments to this? Are there people who see these legal challenges as legitimate attempts to address concerns about election integrity, even if those concerns ultimately turned out to be unfounded?
There definitely are, and it's important to acknowledge that there's a spectrum of views on this.
Okay.
Some people believe that these legal challenges were completely frivolous and motivated solely by a desire to hold on to power, while others believe that they were based on legitimate concerns, even if they were ultimately unsuccessful.
Okay, so it's a complex issue with a lot of nuance.
It is.
But I'm guessing Destiny falls on the more skeptical side of that spectrum.
Definitely, he sees these legal challenges as part of a deliberate and coordinated effort to undermine faith in our democracy,
Okay.
to sow chaos and distrust,
Yeah.
and to create a climate where future attempts to overturn elections might be more successful.
Okay, so it's not just about the specific legal arguments.
Right.
It's about the broader context, the intentions behind those challenges, and the potential long-term consequences for our democracy.
Exactly. And I think it's important to keep that in mind as we continue to unpack these issues.
Yeah.
Because it's not just about analyzing the past, it's about understanding the present and grappling with the uncertainties of the future.
All right, so we've explored a lot of ground here.
We have.
We've looked at Destiny's arguments about the erosion of democratic norms, the rise of political violence, the influence of social media, the decline of traditional institutions, the vulnerabilities of the Constitution, and the legal battles surrounding the 2020 election.
A lot.
But we've also considered the counter-arguments, the reasons for optimism and potential for renewal. It's a lot to process.
It definitely is. And I think it's important to acknowledge that this is just a starting point.
Yeah.
There's so much more to explore, so many different perspectives to consider, and so many complex questions that we need to grapple with as a society.
Okay, so where do we go from here?
Yeah.
What else does Destiny highlight in his analysis? What other themes or insights are we going to unpack as we continue this deep dive?
Well, one area that he spends a lot of time talking about is the rise of extremism, particularly on the right.
Yep.
And he sees this as a symptom of the deeper polarization and fragmentation we've been discussing.
Right.
He argues that as people become more isolated in their own ideological bubbles, they become more susceptible to extreme views, conspiracy theories, and misinformation.
Yeah, it makes sense. Like the internet has created these echo chambers where people can just reinforce their own biases without ever having to confront alternative viewpoints.
Exactly. And Destiny argues that this online radicalization can have real-world consequences.
Yeah.
As we saw with the January 6th attack.
Okay, so he's concerned about the connection between online extremism and real-world violence.
Yeah.
What are some of the specific groups or ideologies he highlights as being particularly dangerous?
He talks a lot about white supremacist groups, anti-government militias, and conspiracy theory communities.
Yeah.
He sees these groups as becoming increasingly mainstream,
Okay.
emboldened by political rhetoric and the spread of misinformation online.
Yeah, it's scary how these extremist views have been creeping into the mainstream. It's like the Overton window has shifted.
Yeah.
And what was once considered fringe or taboo is now openly discussed.
Yeah.
And even embraced by some politicians and media figures.
Exactly. And Destiny argues that this normalization of extremism is a dangerous trend.
Yeah.
One that threatens the very fabric of our democracy.
Okay, so it sounds like Destiny is sounding the alarm about a very real threat.
He is.
But I'm wondering, what does he think needs to be done about it? How do we combat this rise of extremism?
Well, he has a few ideas.
Okay.
One thing he emphasizes is the importance of addressing the root causes of extremism.
Yeah.
He argues that we need to tackle issues like economic inequality, social alienation, and the decline of trust in institutions.
Okay, so it's not just about cracking down on extremist groups. It's about creating a more just and equitable society.
Yeah.
Where people feel less alienated and more connected to their communities.
Exactly. He also talks about the need for better education and critical thinking skills so that people are less susceptible to propaganda and conspiracy theories.
Right.
And he advocates for stronger law enforcement efforts to monitor and disrupt extremist groups, especially those that are planning or inciting violence.
Okay, so it's a multi-pronged approach.
It is.
It sounds like he's advocating for a combination of social, educational, and legal strategies to combat this problem.
Right. And he also emphasizes the role of individual responsibility.
Okay.
He believes that each of us has a duty to speak out against hate and intolerance, to challenge misinformation when we see it, and to create a more inclusive and respectful online environment.
Yeah, that's so important. It's easy to feel powerless.
It is.
In the face of these massive challenges.
Yeah.
But we all have a role to play in pushing back against extremism and defending our democratic values.
Absolutely. And I think that's what Destiny is trying to do with his work. He's trying to raise awareness about these issues.
Right.
To provoke discussion and to inspire people to take action.
Okay, so we've talked about the rise of extremism.
Yes.
And Destiny's proposed solutions.
Right.
But I'm wondering, does he also talk about the role of political leaders in all this.
Okay.
I mean, it feels like the rhetoric coming from some politicians is actually contributing to the problem.
He definitely addresses that.
Okay.
He's very critical of politicians who use divisive language, who stoke fear and resentment, and who exploit people's anxieties for political gain.
Yeah, it feels like some politicians are more interested in winning elections than in actually governing.
Totally.
And they're willing to say or do anything to achieve their goals.
Right. And Destiny argues that this kind of cynical politics is incredibly damaging.
Yeah.
It erodes trust in institutions, it deepens divides, and it makes it harder to find common ground and solve problems.
So what does he think needs to be done about this? Does he think there's any way to hold these politicians accountable?
He believes that it starts with citizens being more informed and engaged.
Okay.
He wants people to pay attention to what politicians are saying and doing, to hold them accountable for their words and actions, and to support candidates who are committed to truth, integrity, and the common good.
Okay, so it's about being informed voters, making our voices heard, and demanding better from our leaders.
Exactly. He also talks about the importance of supporting organizations that are working to promote democracy, to combat misinformation, and to hold those in power accountable.
Yeah, it feels like we need a multi-pronged approach here.
We do.
It's not just about individual actions. It's also about supporting the institutions and organizations that are working to protect our democracy.
Exactly. And I think that's what Destiny's trying to do with his platform.
Yeah.
He's trying to be a voice for those who are concerned about the state of our democracy. To provide information and analysis and to connect people with resources and opportunities to get involved.
Okay, so we've explored Destiny's concerns about the rise of extremism, the role of political leaders, and the importance of citizen engagement.
Totally.
But I'm wondering, does he also talk about the role of the media in all this?
Okay.
I mean, it feels like the media landscape has become so fragmented and polarized, and that's contributing to the problem.
He definitely talks about the media.
Okay.
And he sees it as a key player in shaping our political discourse and our understanding of the world.
Right.
He acknowledges that the media landscape has changed dramatically in recent years with the rise of social media and the decline of traditional news outlets. And he sees both positive and negative aspects to this transformation.
Okay, so it's not a simple black and white issue.
It's not.
What are some of the positive aspects he sees?
Well, he recognizes that the internet and social media have democratized access to information.
Okay.
They've given a voice to people who were previously marginalized or silenced. And they've allowed for a more diverse range of perspectives to be heard.
Yeah, that's definitely a positive development. It's harder for those in power to control the narrative when there's so many different voices and sources of information out there.
Exactly. But he also points out that this democratization of information has come with some serious downsides.
Like what? What are some of the negative aspects he sees?
Well, one big concern he has is the rise of misinformation and disinformation.
Oh, yeah.
It's become incredibly easy for false or misleading information to spread online, often faster than the truth can catch up.
Yeah, it feels like we're living in an era of fake news where it's harder than ever to discern fact from fiction.
Totally.
And that's incredibly dangerous for a democracy.
Absolutely. And Destiny argues that this problem is exacerbated by the fact that many people get their news from social media, where algorithms prioritize engagement over accuracy.
Right.
So the most sensationalistic, the most outrageous content is often what gets shared and seen the most.
Right.
Even if it's completely false.
Okay, so that's a huge challenge. And it's not just about fake news.
Yeah, it's not.
There's also the problem of bias and spin.
Yes.
Even in legitimate news outlets.
Right. And Destiny is critical of the way in which some media outlets have become increasingly partisan, catering to their target audiences and reinforcing their existing biases.
It's like we're living in these separate media universes.
It is.
Each with its own set of facts and interpretations.
Exactly. And Destiny argues that this media fragmentation is a serious threat to our democracy.
Yeah.
Because when we can't even agree on basic facts, it's impossible to have meaningful debates, to hold our leaders accountable, or to make informed decisions about our future.
Okay, so it sounds like Destiny is painting a pretty bleak picture of the media landscape.
It is pretty bleak.
But I'm wondering, does he offer any solutions?
He does.
Okay.
Is there any way to address these problems? I think there are. He emphasizes the importance of media literacy.
Okay.
He wants people to be more critical consumers of information.
Okay.
To be able to identify bias, to fact-check claims.
Right.
And to seek out diverse perspective.
Yeah. That makes sense. It's about being more aware of how the media works,
Yeah.
how information is presented, and how to evaluate different sources.
Exactly. He also talks about the need for greater accountability
Okay.
in the media industry.
Okay.
He believes that journalists and media organizations have a responsibility to be accurate, fair, and transparent in their reporting.
Right.
And he advocates for stronger ethical standards and mechanisms to address misinformation and bias.
Okay, so it's about both individual responsibility and systemic change.
It is.
We need to be more discerning consumers of information.
Yeah.
And we need to push for a more ethical and accountable media ecosystem.
Exactly. And Destiny also sees a role for government in addressing these issues.
Okay.
He supports policies that promote media diversity and local journalism that combat the spread of misinformation and that protect freedom of the press.
Okay, so it's a complex problem with no easy solutions.
It is.
But it sounds like Destiny believes that we can address these challenges through a combination of education, individual action, industry reform, and government policy.
Exactly. And I think that's a message of hope, even amidst all the doom and gloom.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that we're not powerless in the face of these challenges, that we can make a difference if we're willing to engage, to think critically, and to hold those in power accountable.
Okay, so we've explored Destiny's concerns about the media landscape and his proposed solutions.
Right.
But I'm wondering, does he also talk about the role of individuals in all this?
Okay.
I mean, it's easy to feel overwhelmed by these massive problems, like what can one person really do?
He definitely talks about the importance of individual action.
Okay.
He believes that each of us has a responsibility to be an active and engaged citizen, to speak out against injustice, to defend our democratic values, and to work towards a more just and equitable society.
Okay, but what does that look like in practice? What are some concrete actions that people can take?
Well, he encourages people to educate themselves about the issues, to stay informed about current events, and to be aware of the forces that are shaping our political landscape.
Yeah.
He also emphasizes the importance of voting in every election, no matter how small or local.
Yeah, that's basic, but it's so important. It's easy to get cynical.
It is.
And feel like our votes don't matter.
Yeah.
But they really do.
They do. And he also encourages people to get involved in their communities, to volunteer for causes they believe in, to contact their elected officials, and to support organizations that are working to promote democracy and social justice.
Okay, so it's about being informed.
Yeah.
Voting, getting involved in our communities, supporting organizations.
Yeah.
It sounds like a lot, but it also feels empowering.
It is.
It's a reminder that we're not just passive observers.
Right.
We can actually make a difference.
Exactly. And Destiny believes that when people are apathetic, when they disengage from the political process, it creates a vacuum that can be filled by special interests, extremists, and those who would exploit our divisions for their own gain. But when people are active and engaged, when they hold those in power accountable, it strengthens our democracy and makes it more resilient to these threats.
Okay, so it's not just about complaining about the problems. It's about actively working to solve them.
Yes.
It's about being part of the solution.
It is.
Not part of the problem.
Right, and I think that's what Destiny's trying to do with his work.
Yeah.
He's trying to inspire people to get involved, to fight for the kind of future they want to see, and to believe that change is possible.
Okay, so we've explored Destiny's concerns about the state of our democracy, the challenges we face, and the potential solutions.
Yes.
But I'm wondering, does he also talk about the role of hope in all this?
Okay.
I mean, it's easy to get discouraged when you're constantly bombarded with negative news and dire predictions. So how do we maintain hope in the face of all this?
That's a great question, and it's one that Destiny addresses directly.
Okay.
He acknowledges that it's easy to fall into despair, especially given the magnitude of the problems we face.
Right.
But he argues that despair is not an option.
Okay.
He believes that we need to hold on to hope, not as a naive belief that everything will magically work out, but as a fuel for action, as a source of energy to keep fighting for a better future.
Okay, so it's not about ignoring the problems or pretending that everything is fine.
Right.
It's about acknowledging the challenges, but also believing that we can overcome them.
Exactly. And he emphasizes that hope is not passive. It's not something that just happens to us. It's something that we choose to cultivate, to nurture, and to act upon.
So how do we cultivate hope? How do we keep it alive in the face of all the negativity and cynicism that surrounds us?
Destiny suggests a few things.
Okay.
One is to focus on the positive.
Okay.
to celebrate the victories no matter how small.
Yeah.
He encourages people to seek out stories of courage, resilience, and compassion, and to find inspiration in the people and organizations that are working to make the world a better place.
Yeah, it's easy to get bogged down in the negativity, but it's important to remember that there are good things happening in the world, and there are people fighting for change.
There are. And he also emphasizes the importance of connecting with others, of building community, and of finding strength and support in shared purpose.
Right.
He believes that isolation and alienation breed despair.
Yeah.
While connection and solidarity foster hope.
Okay, so it's about focusing on the positive, celebrating the victories, connecting with others, building community.
Yeah.
It's about choosing hope over despair.
It is.
And channeling that hope into action.
Exactly. And I think that's a powerful message.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, the future of our democracy depends on our ability to believe that change is possible, to work towards a better future, and to never give up hope.
Well said.
Yeah.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for taking this deep dive with me. It's been eye-opening.
It's been my pleasure. And remember, this is just the beginning of the conversation.
Yeah.
We encourage you to keep exploring these issues, to engage in thoughtful dialogue, and to take action to create the kind of future you want to see. Because the future of our democracy depends on it.